There is a moment in every life when the universe stops pretending, when the curtain pulls back and you see the machinery behind the magic, when you realize that everything you believed about success, about power, about how the world works was never the truth but just the story they told you to keep you in your place. And for me that moment came on a Thursday afternoon in Chicago, delivered by a man who couldn't tie his own shoes without written instructions. But before I take you into that room and show you how 7 words from a mediocre boss transformed me from invisible to unstoppable, you need to understand something that took me 30 years to learn, that the game was never fair but it was always learnable, and what I'm about to share with you isn't motivation or inspiration or positive thinking or any of the other garbage they sell to keep you docile. This is strategy. This is psychology. This is the operating manual for human nature that they never gave you in school. This is what Robert Greene spent 20 years distilling from 5,000 years of history, what Machiavelli discovered while watching princes rise and fall, what Sun Tzu wrote in blood on bamboo scrolls, and by the time you finish reading this you will never see the world the same way again. I grew up in a small town 45 minutes outside Pittsburgh where the steel mills had died but the mentality lived on, a place where ambition was treated as arrogance, where wanting more than your parents had was seen as betrayal of your roots, where the highest compliment you could receive was, "He's a nice kid, knows his place," and I knew my place. I learned it early watching what happened to kids who stood out. The smart kids got mocked, the ambitious kids got resented, the confident kids got put back in their boxes so fast their heads spun, so I stayed in my box. I made myself small so others could feel big, I dimmed my light so they wouldn't feel threatened, I apologized for existing, for succeeding, for having opinions that didn't match the mediocre consensus. And by the time I graduated high school I had mastered the art of being invisible. I could walk through a room full of people and leave no trace. I could sit through an entire conversation and say nothing memorable. I could work twice as hard as everyone around me and remain completely unnoticed. I thought this was humility. I thought this was virtue. I thought if I just kept my head down and worked hard enough someone would eventually notice and give me what I deserved. I was wrong about everything. But here's the thing about environments like that. They don't just discourage your confidence. Designed to keep me exactly where I was, not because they were evil but because they were comfortable and my discomfort would threaten their comfort. And Robert Greene writes about this in Mastery, how our environment shapes us more than we know, how we absorb the values of those around us like sponges, how most people never break free because they never realize they're in a cage, and I was in a cage, I just couldn't see the bars. I moved to Chicago at 23 because that's what you did if you wanted to escape a small town. I had a degree in marketing, no connections, no mentors, and a burning desire to prove myself that I mistook for ambition. My first job was at a marketing firm downtown, not the glamorous part of marketing but the grinding part where you sit in a gray cubicle under fluorescent lights writing email copy for products you don't believe in, for clients you've never met, for people who don't care. And I threw myself into it with the desperation of someone who had something to prove. I showed up early, I stayed late, I took on extra projects, I covered for lazy coworkers, I never complained, I never asked for anything. I was the perfect employee, reliable, consistent, agreeable, easy to work with, and completely utterly invisible. 3 years passed, 3 years of grinding, 3 years of hoping, 3 years of watching people who started after me get promoted, get recognition, get opportunities one never even heard about, and I told myself it was fine. I told myself my time would come. I told myself that hard work always pays off eventually. Then came November 15, 2018, a Thursday at 2:47 p.m. I'll never forget that moment because it's the day the programming finally broke. My boss Dave called me into his office. Dave was in his 50s, overweight, perpetually sweating, the kind of manager who got his position through longevity rather than competence. He sat behind his desk scrolling through his phone while I stood there like a servant waiting for permission to speak. "Close the door," he said without looking up. I closed it. "So," he said, finally making eye contact, "we're promoting someone to senior account manager. Wanted you to hear it from me first." My heart actually sped up. 3 years of grinding. This was it. "We're giving it to Mike." Mike had been there 14 months. Mike spent half his day watching YouTube videos with his headphones on. Mike had literally asked me the previous week how to do a basic Excel function that I'd shown him 3 times before. Mike? I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I've been here 3 years, I know. Dave cut me off, waving his hand like he was shooing a fly. You're reliable, you're consistent, you're a solid worker, but Mike has presence, you know, he speaks up. In meetings, he's confident, people notice him, you're just kind of there, you don't stand out, you're just kind of there. He actually said that to me. 3 years of early mornings and late nights, 3 years of extra projects and covering for lazy co-workers, 3 years of never complaining, never asking for anything, never making waves, and my boss's final verdict was that I was just kind of there. I walked out of that office and straight into the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, sat on the toilet with my head in my hands, breathing slowly, trying not to cry, but I didn't cry. Something else happened. Sitting there in that stale bathroom with the flickering lights and the smell of cheap disinfectant, I felt something shift, not sadness, not anger, something colder, something harder. He was right, I was just kind of there. I'd spent my entire life being just kind of there, making myself small, staying quiet, hoping someone would notice me without me having to demand to be noticed. And where had it gotten me? Nowhere, absolutely nowhere. I went home that night and didn't sleep, just sat in my shoebox apartment in Lincoln Park in the dark, staring at the wall. My apartment was expensive for what it was, a cramped 1-bedroom with thin walls and a view of another building. I'd chosen it for convenience, not for living. Everything in my life was chosen for convenience, for practicality, for what made sense to other people. That night for the first time I asked myself a different kind of question, not what should I do, not what's practical, not what would make sense. I asked myself, what would I do if I wasn't afraid, not what would I want to do, not what would be nice to do, what would I actually do if fear was completely removed from the equation. And the answers came like water through a broken dam. I'd stop apologizing for everything, I'd stop explaining my decisions, I'd stop trying to make everyone comfortable, I'd stop asking for permission, I'd start taking what I wanted, I'd start speaking my mind, I'd start walking away from people who drained me, I'd start demanding what I deserved, I'd start being honest about my ambitions, I'd stop hiding my intelligence, I'd stop pretending to be smaller than I am, I'd stop waiting for my turn and start taking it. But here's the problem, I didn't know how to be that person. I'd spent 26 years being the opposite, being nice, being agreeable, being small, being invisible, being just kind of there. I needed a new education, and I wasn't going to find it in any book my teachers had recommended, I wasn't going to find it in any corporate training program, I wasn't going to find it in the self-help section at Barnes & Noble. I needed to understand how power actually works, not how we pretend it works, not how it works in movies and motivational speeches. How it actually really truly works in the real world. So I began my real education. Over the next 2 years I read everything I could find about human nature, strategy, influence, and power. I read during my lunch breaks, I read on the train, I read at night when I couldn't sleep, I read on weekends when everyone else was out living their lives. I didn't read for inspiration, I read for understanding. From Niccolò Machiavelli I learned that power has its own morality, that being good and being effective are often different things, that the people who succeed aren't necessarily the most virtuous but the most strategic. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513 after being tortured, exiled, and stripped of everything he loved. He wrote it not as a guide to evil but as an honest assessment of how power actually works. He understood something that most people never grasp, that politics, business, relationships, all of human interaction is a game of power, and if you don't understand the rules of that game, you're not a player, you're a pawn. From Sun Tzu I learned that the greatest victory is the one that requires no battle, that positioning is everything, that if you understand your enemy and yourself you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War 2,500 years ago, and every word remains relevant today because human nature hasn't changed. From Karl von Clausewitz I learned about the fog of war, the uncertainty that surrounds every human endeavor. I learned that no plan survives contact with the enemy and that adaptability is more valuable than preparation. Clausewitz understood that life is messy, that information is always incomplete, and that the ability to adjust in real time is more important than any grand strategy. From Julius Caesar I learned about momentum, about how one decisive action can change everything, about how crossing the Rubicon isn't just a phrase but a moment when you commit so completely that retreat becomes impossible. From Napoleon Bonaparte I learned about timing, about knowing when to strike and when to wait, about how speed can be its own form of power. From François de la Rochefoucauld I learned that hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue, that people will always claim noble motives for base actions, that understanding this synthesize all of this into practical laws. Greene spent decades studying the great strategists of history and distilling their wisdom into principles anyone can apply. From Greene I learned that power is a game with rules most people never learn, that human nature hasn't changed in 5,000 years and never will, that the people who succeed aren't necessarily smarter or harder working but just better at understanding the dynamics of power, that most people are asleep and the awake have an unfair advantage, that what looks like luck is usually preparation meeting opportunity, that what looks like talent is usually strategy making skill visible, and what I learned shattered every belief I'd ever held and led me to the 7 transformations that made me dangerously confident. Transformation 1, from noise to silence. The first transformation was the hardest because it required doing nothing. In 1498 when Machiavelli was appointed secretary to the Florentine Republic he didn't rush to impress his colleagues with his opinions. He watched, he listened, he observed. He understood that in any new environment the one who speaks first reveals the most and the one who speaks last reveals nothing, and I learned this in that conference room at 23 when the most powerful person barely said 10 words the entire meeting, but when he spoke everyone leaned forward, when he asked a question the temperature shifted, when he remained silent while others rambled you could feel them slowly realizing they were revealing too much. That's when it hit me, silence isn't empty, it's full of meaning. When your silent people project onto you, they assume you're judging them, evaluating them, seeing through their masks, and here's the devastating truth, you are, while they're talking they're showing you exactly who they are, their insecurities, their desperation, their pressure points. But when you're always talking you're the one being dissected. Robert Greene's Law 4 is always say less than necessary. When you're trying to impress people with words the more you say the more common you appear. Powerful people impress by saying less, they create aura by being mysterious. I started practicing this immediately. Instead of jumping into conversations I started observing them. Instead of proving I was smart I started letting others prove they weren't as smart as they thought. Instead of competing for airtime I started controlling the rhythm of every interaction simply by choosing when my words were worth the room's attention. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. People started coming to me for my opinion instead of me desperately offering it. They started working harder for my approval because I stopped giving it away for free. They started wondering what I was thinking because I stopped thinking out loud. The lesson: your mouth is your enemy. Every word you speak is information you're giving away for free. Every explanation you offer is a weakness you're advertising. Every time you fill an uncomfortable silence you're telling the room that their comfort matters more than your power. The person who can sit comfortably in silence while others squirm controls the energy of the room. They don't need to speak to lead. They don't need noise to command attention. Silence isn't the absence of power, it's the proof that you don't need noise to control the room. Transformation 2, from reaction to observation. The second transformation came through betrayal. In 1527 Machiavelli died embittered and impoverished, having spent his last years watching less capable men rise while he fell, consumed by anger at how he'd been treated. His mistake was that he let his emotions dictate his actions. 2 years ago someone I trusted completely destroyed me. They took everything I'd shared in confidence and used it as ammunition in a room full of people whose respect I desperately wanted. My first instinct was to explode, to defend myself, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they'd caused, but something stopped me. I sat there in complete silence while my world burned around me and learned the most valuable lesson of my life, that your emotions are not your identity, they're information, they're temporary chemical reactions that you can observe, analyze, and then choose whether or not to act on. that moment of betrayal didn't break me. It revealed something more powerful than revenge could ever. B. The ability to remain completely calm while someone else loses control. Robert Greene's Law 36 is disdain things you cannot have. The essence of this law is emotional detachment. When you stop caring about what you can't control, you become immune to manipulation. Here's what emotional mastery actually looks like. When someone tries to provoke you, you don't react, you collect data. When someone betrays you, you don't collapse, you take notes. When someone tries to manipulate your emotions, you don't give them the satisfaction of success, you give them the discomfort of failure. This isn't about becoming a robot, this isn't about suppressing your feelings, this is about understanding that your emotional reactions are choices, not reflexes. When you master your emotional responses, you start seeing other people's emotional reactions as information about them, not verdicts about you. When someone gets angry at you for setting a boundary, you don't see it as evidence that you were wrong, you see it as evidence that your boundary was necessary. The lesson: your emotions should be a choice, not a reflex. Master this and you'll never again be controlled by anyone who thinks they know which buttons to push. Transformation 3, from transparency to strategy. The third transformation was about information. In Renaissance Italy, the Medici family understood something their rivals never grasped. That information is more valuable than gold. They built an intelligence network that spanned Europe, collecting secrets that would later destroy their enemies and elevate their friends. I used to be an open book. The moment they know what you want, they can block you. The moment they know what you fear, they can exploit you. I started treating my personal information like a classified government document, not because I had anything to hide, but because I finally understood that mystery creates respect, scarcity creates value, and the less people know about your internal process, the more they have to respect your external results. Watch the most powerful people you know. How much do you really know about their private struggles, their detailed plans, their moment-to-moment emotional state? Almost nothing, and that's not an accident. The lesson: information is power. Who has it, who needs it, who controls the flow of it determines who holds the real power in any situation. While you were being taught that sharing is caring, others were learning that knowledge is leverage. Every conversation is an intelligence gathering operation. Every person you meet is either gathering information about you or sharing information about themselves. The question is, are you conscious of this exchange, or are you accidentally giving away state secrets while they're collecting classified intelligence? Transformation 4, from likable to valuable. The fourth transformation was the most painful because it required admitting I'd been wrong my whole life. In the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci wasn't the most liked artist in Florence. He wasn't the most agreeable, he wasn't the easiest to work with, he was notorious for taking forever to finish commissions, for getting distracted by new ideas, for being difficult and demanding. But he was the most competent, and because he was irreplaceable, people put up with his eccentricities, his delays, his perfectionism. I spent 3 years being the nicest person at every job I ever had. I was agreeable, accommodating, always willing to help. I thought job security came from being liked. Then I watched someone half as nice but twice as competent get promoted over me again and again. That's when I realized the brutal truth that nobody wants to tell you: nice doesn't make you necessary, agreeable doesn't make you valuable, being easy to work with doesn't guarantee anything except being easy to replace. You know what does? Being so undeniably good at what you do that replacing you would cost more time, money, and risk than keeping you around. Even when you're demanding respect, setting boundaries, and refusing to accept treatment that doesn't match your value. The lesson: competence is your insurance policy against other people's moods, preferences, and changing loyalties. When you're irreplaceably good at something important, people have to deal with you as you are, not as they wish you were. I became obsessed with being the best at something that mattered. I studied every aspect of my field until I knew things that people with decades more experience didn't know. I solved problems that had been accepted as just how things are. I made myself the person who made everything around them function better. When you reach this level, something beautiful happens. You stop competing with other people and start competing with previous versions of yourself. You stop worrying about job security and start choosing between opportunities. You stop asking for raises and start negotiating partnerships. Competence is the foundation of every other form of power. Build it first, build it ruthlessly, and everything else becomes negotiable. Transformation 5. From explaining to existing. The fifth transformation was about letting go. when Galileo was condemned by the Catholic Church for suggesting the Earth moved around the Sun. He didn't spend his remaining years trying to convince his accusers. He understood something that took me years to learn. Some people are committed to misunderstanding you. 5 years ago I left a stable job to pursue something that everyone thought I was crazy to pursue. The reaction was swift and brutal. Family members questioned my sanity. Friends predicted my failure. Colleagues whispered about my arrogance. I spent months trying to explain my reasoning. I presented detailed plans, financial projections, market research. Nothing I said mattered. They had already decided who I was, what I was capable of, and what I deserved. That's when I learned the most liberating truth of my life, that there are people in this world who are not confused about you. They're committed to their version of you because changing their mind would require them to change their entire worldview. They need you to fail because your success would mean they have no excuse for their mediocrity. You cannot logic someone out of a position they didn't logic themselves into. You cannot convince someone to respect you when their entire identity depends on feeling superior to you. You cannot make someone see your worth when they need you to be worthless to feel valuable. The lesson: when you stop explaining yourself to people who aren't genuinely trying to understand you, you free up enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy you can redirect toward building relationships with people who recognize your worth instinctively, creating work that speaks for itself, developing skills that make their opinions completely irrelevant. Your worth doesn't decrease based on someone else's inability to see it. Your value doesn't diminish because someone else is invested in underestimating it. Transformation 6, from dependency to sovereignty. The sixth transformation was about structure. In ancient Rome, the most powerful people weren't those with the most friends or the most money. They were those with the most options, multiple sources of income, multiple alliances, multiple paths to power. I used to think freedom was a feeling, that rush of possibility when you imagined escaping all your constraints. I thought freedom meant not having to answer to anyone. I was confusing freedom with chaos. Real freedom isn't the absence of structure, it's the presence of structures that serve your goals instead of other people's agendas. It's building systems that work whether other people participate or not, that generate results whether other people approve or not, that create value whether other people recognize it or not. Most people build their entire lives around other people's schedules, decisions, and moods. Their happiness depends on their boss's approval, their income depends on their employer's budget, their self-worth depends on their partner's validation. This isn't connection, this is voluntary imprisonment with better marketing. I learned this when every system in my life collapsed simultaneously: the job, the relationship, the friendships. In one devastating month, discovering that everything I thought was mine was actually just on loan. That crisis became the greatest gift of my life because it forced me to build real systems, multiple streams of income, skills that belonged to me, not my employer, routines that worked whether anyone else participated or not, boundaries that protected my energy from people who'd drain it, a life that functioned whether I was alone or with others, an identity not tied to any role or relationship. The lesson: systems create options, options create power, power creates freedom. Build your systems before you need them. Dependencies make you negotiable, systems make you sovereign. Transformation 7, from clinging to walking away. The seventh transformation was the ultimate test. In 44 BC, when Brutus joined the conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar, he wasn't being cruel, he was being strategic. He understood something that most people never grasp, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is the hardest thing. 3 years ago I had to fire my best friend, not from a job but from my life. We had grown up together, shared everything together, built dreams together, but somewhere along the way our paths diverged. I was growing, building, creating while they were stagnating, complaining, draining. Every conversation became them explaining why their life wasn't working while expecting me to fix problems they weren't willing to solve. I kept making excuses for them because I confused loyalty with enabling. The wake-up call came when I realized that every hour I spent listening to their problems was an hour I couldn't spend solving my own challenges. Every piece of energy I gave to their drama was energy I couldn't invest in my goals. The lesson: strategic ruthlessness isn't cruelty, it's the willingness to prioritize your goals over other people's comfort, your growth over other people's expectations, your truth over other people's illusions about what you should be. It's saying no to people you care about when what they're asking for doesn't align with where you're going. it's ending relationships that drain your energy even when those people aren't bad people but just not your people anymore. Your resources, time, energy, attention, are finite. Every yes to one thing is a no to something else. The people who achieve extraordinary things aren't necessarily more talented or luckier than everyone else, they're more willing to make decisions that other people aren't willing to make. Strategic ruthlessness is what allows you to build the life that other people wish they had the courage to build. 3 years after that bathroom breakdown in Chicago, I walked into a boardroom in Manhattan, 30 years old, having left that marketing job and started my own consulting practice built to multiple 6 figures, sitting across from 7 Fortune 500 executives, all older and more experienced than me, all wearing suits that cost more than my first car, all with decades of industry connections and relationships, all with corner offices and corner minds, and for the first time in my life I wasn't nervous. Not because I thought I was better than them, not because I was arrogant, not because I didn't respect what they'd accomplished, not because I didn't want the contract. I wasn't nervous because I'd finally learned what confidence actually is. Confidence isn't thinking you'll win, confidence is knowing you'll be okay if you lose. I had systems, I had options, I had skills that belonged to me, not to any job. I had multiple income streams, I had a life that worked whether I got this contract or not. I had stopped needing their approval. I had become willing to walk away, and because I was willing to walk away, I was completely present, completely calm, completely myself. I didn't try to impress them, I didn't over-explain, I didn't fill silence with nervous chatter, I didn't laugh too hard at their jokes, I didn't agree too quickly with their opinions, I didn't try to prove anything. I just sat there, answered their questions directly, asked my own questions when I needed information, let them do most of the talking, observed, waited, stayed silent when silence was called for. At the end, the CEO, a man in his 60s who'd been in the game 40 years and had forgotten more than I'd ever know, looked at me across the table and said, "You're different. Most people who come in here are desperate, you can see it in their eyes. They need this, they need us, they're auditioning, they're begging, they're selling. You're not. Why?" And I thought about it for a second and said, "Because I already have everything I need. This would be nice, it would be a great opportunity, it would be exciting, but it's not necessary. I don't need this to be okay, I'm already okay." He laughed, shook his head, looked at his colleagues, then he stood up, reached across the table, and shook my hand. "We'll be in touch," he said, and they signed the contract the next week. Let me be absolutely clear about something. Dangerous confidence isn't about being mean. It's not about hurting people, it's not about becoming cold or cruel or manipulative, it's not about treating people like objects or using them for your own gain. That's not power, that's just pathology with better marketing. Real dangerous confidence is about becoming real, real about what you want, real about what you'll tolerate, real about your worth, real about your boundaries, real about your strengths and weaknesses, real about your ambitions and fears, real about the fact that you're going to die someday and you don't have time to waste on people and situations that drain you. Most people spend their entire lives playing small, apologizing for existing, waiting for permission, hoping someone will notice them and give them what they deserve, living for other people's approval, dying for other people's opinions. They die waiting. Don't be one of them. The world doesn't need more people who are nice and agreeable and easy to ignore. The world has plenty of those. They're everywhere. They're invisible, they're forgettable, they're furniture. The world needs people who are willing to be seen, willing to be known, willing to stand for something even when it's uncomfortable, willing to risk rejection in exchange for the possibility of real connection, real success, real life, willing to be hated for who they are rather than loved for who they're pretending to be. That's dangerous confidence. It's not about being fearless, it's about feeling the fear and doing it anyway. It's not about never failing, it's about knowing you might fail and trying anyway. It's not about always winning, it's about accepting that you might lose and still playing the game. It's not about being immune to rejection, it's about accepting that people might reject you and being yourself anyway. It's about realizing finally and completely that the only person whose approval you actually need is yourself. If you study history closely, you'll notice something fascinating. Every great figure who ever lived, every conqueror, every creator, every leader who changed the world, went through a transformation similar to the one I've described. They all had a moment when they realized the rules they'd been taught were lies. They all had a period of intense study and observation. They all developed mastery in their chosen field. they all learned to control their emotions rather than being controlled by them, they all became strategic about what they revealed and what they concealed. They all built systems that outlasted any single victory or defeat, and they all became willing to walk away from anything that didn't serve their purpose. This pattern repeats across centuries because human nature doesn't change, the circumstances change, the technology changes, the costumes change, but the game remains the same, and the people who understand this game, really understand it, have an advantage that no amount of talent, hard work, or luck can overcome. So here's my question for you after everything you've just read, after the story of that kid from Pittsburgh. After the 7 transformations, after the betrayal and the boardroom and the historical patterns, what would you do if you weren't afraid, not if you had more confidence, not if you felt ready, not if you knew you'd succeed, not if you had guarantees, not if everyone approved, if you simply weren't afraid? Who would you become? What would you try? What would you say? What would you demand? What would you walk away from? What would you walk toward? What life would you build? What love would you pursue? What dreams would you finally stop hiding? What version of yourself have you been keeping locked away? You already know the answers. They're in you right now underneath all the conditioning, all the people-pleasing, all the fear of what others might think, all the years of making yourself small. They've always been there waiting. The only question is whether you'll let them out. The game was never rigged against you, you just never learned the real rules, but now you know them, you've seen how they work, you've watched someone apply them and transform his entire life from invisible to unstoppable. The question isn't whether you can become dangerously confident, because you can, every person can. The principles are universal, the psychology is consistent, the strategies are proven. The question isn't whether you deserve it, because you do, you've always deserved it, you were born deserving it, nobody's permission was ever required. The only question is will you finally stop waiting for permission and start taking what's yours? Will you finally stop making yourself small so others can feel big? Will you finally stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you? Will you finally stop begging for approval from people who can't give it? Will you finally stop being a ghost in your own life? Will you finally become the person you've always known you could be? I did, and my only regret is that I waited so long, that I spent 26 years being invisible when I could have spent them being alive, that I let fear make my decisions for me, that I gave away my power to people who never deserved it, that I apologized for existing in a world that needed me to exist fully. Don't make the same mistake. Start now, not tomorrow, not next week, not when you feel ready, not when you have all the answers, not when it's safe. Now, today, this moment, because here's the truth they don't tell you, the truth that took me 26 years to learn. You'll never feel ready, you'll never feel confident enough, you'll never feel like you have all the answers. That feeling never comes, it's a mirage, it's something you chase your whole life and never catch. The only thing that comes is the decision, the choice, the moment when you stop asking for permission and start taking what's yours, the moment when you stop being a ghost and start being a person, the moment when you stop waiting for your life to begin and realize it already has. That moment is right now. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars but in ourselves, that we are underlings. If you made it this far, drop one word in the comments, dangerous, subscribe for more, turn on notifications, and remember, the only permission you need is your own.